the second half of The Road to Wigan Pier is mostly, although he's saying we need socialism and saying some of the reasons why he thinks we need socialism, it's mostly an attack on socialists, not socialism, socialists, for the way they make their case. And what he's saying is you are preachers of modern industry progress, and he goes to extremes in some cases. He says there is no advantage in people getting shorter working hours because they'll only spend the extra leisure time doing things that are worthless. And he says things like that. If you ask the question, what would Orwell have thought about Antifa? That's rather a difficult question in this. It's difficult for a number of reasons. First of all, Orwell was an anti-fascist, called himself an anti-fascist, and was very. Although he went through a period of what the communists would call ultra-leftism, where he was very much opposed to a war against fascism, and that lasted from, let's say, June 1937 to August 1939, when he suddenly, as a result of a dream he had, I'm not making this up, he suddenly became very pro-war. This was a period where everybody knew the war with Germany was coming, and most of the left was saying it was an anti-fascist war. And Orwell suddenly, overnight, about a week before the actual war broke out, in early September 1939, Orwell became pro-war. Now he was an anti-fascist. One of the things that I experienced actually when I was at university in the late 1960s was there were Trotskyist groups that would use violence against certain speakers who they categorized as fascist, although these speakers were not fascist in any sense that Orwell would have recognized, or in any sense that the 1930s left would have recognized. For instance, Enoch Powell, the leading British politician who was very much in favor of imposing restrictions on coloured immigration into Britain, they would break up his meetings and attack people. And they would say this was anti-fascism. Now, so what we're witnessing now in the US, where Antifa goes and attacks people who are not, they're in many cases attacking people who are not doing anything violent just because of their views. But these views can be Christian, conservative, libertarian, or anything. They attack all kinds of people, and they claim to be attacking fascism. But they're not. But the people, they're defining fascism so broadly that it means anything that doesn't fit in with about 2% of the population who agree with the extreme left views of Antifa. Now, Orwell, of course, lived at a time when there were pitched battles in the streets between left and right. This was a familiar feature of European society in the 30s. In London, the Black Shirts, the British Union of Fascists, organized marches through the East End of London, which over the previous, let's say, 50 years had become heavily Jewish because of Jewish immigration from the Russian Empire. And the communists and fellow travelers went along to attack Mosley and the Black Shirts. So there were pitched battles in the streets. But what's different today is that the fascists were genuinely fascists, and the people attacking them were openly communists for the most part. So you had two groups, fascists and communists, both of which who had the support of considerably less than 1% each of the British population. So none of them could make a showing in elections. You had these two groups battling in the streets. So that was what was going on in London in Orwell's day. What you've got today, it seems to me, is a group of people who attack anybody for anything. If you take the view that men dressed as women shouldn't be able to get into girls' bathrooms, then you're going to be a fascist and you're going to get your head beaten in by Antifa. It's a completely different kind of situation.
I'm interested in Mr. Steele unpacking a little bit your subtitle, The Worldview on a Slab. It seems to me one of the main arguments that you're making is that Orwell, far from being kind of an independent maverick type guy, it was actually kind of following a lot of the ideological trends of the time. So I'm curious about what I'm sure you answer this at length in the book, but I'm curious about what worldview you're seeing as being on the slab. That if Orwell is kind of continually moving positions, what is kind of the core that you're taking issue with, or attacking, or discussing mostly in your book?
Right. Well, perhaps I should say a few things to clarify. One is that I do several things in the book. The biggest thing I do that takes up the most space and that I think is the heart of the book is I try to pin down exactly what Orwell believed as a matter of objective fact, independent of whether I agree with it or disagree with it. So that's and I think it's that my book is the first book to give an accurate picture of the totality of Orwell's beliefs on such things as capitalism, socialism, democracy, totalitarianism, the purpose of life, sexuality, all those things. And I think that the great majority of writing that deals with this it deals with the question of what Orwell believed. It has got serious errors. And so I'm claiming something quite ambitious. I'm claiming that I'm trying to overturn a consensus among people who write about Orwell about what Orwell believed. So that's one thing I do. The second thing I do is I try to relate what Orwell believed to what contemporaries of his believed and predecessors, earlier people. So I try to put his ideas in the context of an evolving system of beliefs. A third thing I do is I actually criticize some beliefs held by Orwell and others. Because it's in my criticisms that people might detect that I'm a libertarian, or I've got views of my own that are not conformable with the left. But I would say this, that most people who have an idea about what Orwell believed are likely to be a bit surprised and a bit shocked by the picture of Orwell's beliefs that I give, and libertarians just as much as leftists. I mean, I think that because, as Tim was saying earlier, that Orwell is one of these people that everybody wants to claim, and everybody wants to say, so a lot of libertarians hear that Orwell was a socialist, and they think, but he was a nice socialist. He was moderate. He must have been a moderate socialist, or possibly a socialist with an anarchist streak, which is the direct opposite of the truth. He had after 1935, he had no time for anarchism, despite having friends who were anarchists, and he didn't give his socialism an anarchist orientation at all. And that's part of the reason he was so pessimistic was because, I mean, one of the fundamental things about Orwell's beliefs is this. He believed that collectivism was the future. He didn't think that was a matter for choice. He didn't think we had any choice about that. He thought that modern technology, the machine civilization, automatically gave rise to a centralized government-controlled system. And the only question was, could we make this centralized government-controlled system compatible with civil liberties and democracy, or was it inherent in this collectivized system that it had to lead to a totalitarian dictatorship? And he grew a bit more pessimistic about that as time went on, and began to think that whatever we did, the future was totalitarian. But his thinking was, we have no choice about that. Basically, he thought that capitalism was at the end of its rope, that it had no resources left, and that therefore some kind of collectivism was absolutely inevitable. He hoped it would be a democratic kind of collectivism. When Orwell talks about democracy, he's mainly thinking not of majority voting, although he doesn't exclude that, of course, but he's thinking of civil liberties. He's thinking of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of thought, which he valued very highly. and which he took part in agitating for on particular occasions. So all kinds of people will be a bit surprised and a bit shocked by my picture of Orwell's actual beliefs, and they're right across the political spectrum.
Thank you.
One of the things I was a little surprised about was that in all the years of my reading about socialism and capitalism, I had not heard the term post-socialism applied to the ideas that Orwell started out with. Is this your coinage, or is this in the literature?
It's my coinage. This is my theory, okay, and it's developed in the book. My view is this: that socialism suffered a mortal blow intellectually in the 1880s, and it never recovered intellectually from this mortal blow. There are various ways in which one might imagine hypothetically that socialism might be rejected after people had accepted it, right? But what actually happened was that the people who rejected socialism at the end of the 19th century were part of what we call the fin de siècle. They rejected socialism because they rejected progress. They were disillusioned with progress and rationality. And so you get this big movement against socialism, not on the grounds that socialism isn't true rationality and isn't true progress, but on the grounds that progress and rationality are more than have been overrated, and there's a reaction against. So those fin de siècle people who thought like that, they reached back into history to find other people who'd been against progress. And lo and behold, who did they find in British history? You know, in Italy, they found people like Vico, but in Britain, they found Jonathan Swift. Now, it just so happens that the writer who influenced Orwell more than any other writer was Jonathan Swift. Jonathan Swift, Gulliver's Travels, Orwell got a copy of that for his 8th birthday. And he found this book the day before his 8th birthday, and he stayed up all night reading it. And he fell in love with it. He had a very, very high regard for it. And one of the things about Jonathan Swift and Gulliver's Travels is it's against science, it's against progress, it's against modernization, and all those kinds of things. So this was Orwell's view prior to the road to Wigan Pier. The road to Wigan Pier marks a conversion. What Orwell's beliefs were before 1936 is a little less certain, a lot less certain, actually, than after 1936. So there's a certain amount of speculation is necessary. But it seems that in this period leading up to 1935, he didn't like capitalism. So he was one of these intellectuals who was not a socialist, but didn't have a good word to say for capitalism. You know, they're all around us today as well. But he was anti-progress, anti-machine, anti-industrialism. But he gradually became convinced, apparently, in the years 1935, 1936, that this thesis that the future lay with some kind of collectivism. It was just unavoidable, and he better face reality. He felt himself to be facing an unpleasant reality. So what happened was he introduced into his socialist views, when he became a socialist, the post-socialist thinking that he developed earlier. And in fact, this post-socialist thinking you see this throughout the 20s and 30s in intellectuals who were not primarily political. So it's one of the interesting things about the 20s and 30s is the left was growing among intellectuals. Apparently, political intellectuals were left, but artistic intellectuals were right. They were nearly all right-wing. T.S. Eliot, W.B. Yeats, D.H. Lawrence, all these people were reactionaries and would be classed as right-wing by the left. And that's because they were post-socialists. And so Orwell brought this post-socialism with him into the left when he joined the left, essentially in the middle of 1936. And what happened was this. He had various reasons in 1935 for being opposed to socialism. When he's convinced finally that there is no future except a collectivist system, and he becomes a socialist because he wants it to be democratic, this opposition to things he doesn't like about socialism turns into an opposition to the way socialists make their case. So what he says in the second half of The Road to Wigan Pier is socialists are going about this the wrong way, and they're in danger of turning the middle class into fascists because of the way they put their socialist arguments. They shouldn't lay so much stress on industrialization, on machinery, because sensitive modern people are offended by the signs of industrialism and don't like machinery. And there's, all these statements in the second half of The Road to Wigan Pier, like nobody can look at a gas pipe chair. A gas pipe chair was a famous event of the early 20th century, where somebody made a chair out of tubes from gas pipes. And nobody can look at a gas pipe chair without despairing for civilization, right? So it's things like that. What if that's idiotic? Of course you could look at a gas pipe chair and not despair of civilization. But so this is Orwell's view, that, the second half of The Road to Wigan Pier is mostly, although he's saying we need socialism and saying some of the reasons why he thinks we need socialism, it's mostly an attack on socialists, not socialism, socialists, for the way they make their case. And what he's saying is you are preachers of modern industry progress, and he goes to extremes in some cases. He says there is no advantage in people getting shorter working hours because they'll only spend the extra leisure time doing things that are worthless. He says things like that. So he's still got these post-socialist and anti-progress ideas that he's got from the fin de siècle and from Jonathan Swift. And he comes into the socialist movement and starts attacking socialists, but not for the idea of socialism. He concedes that. But because of they're alienating the middle class. They're appealing to the worst instincts in people, he thinks. There's all this stuff about if we have machines turning out more goods, it's going to make us soft, and we're going to lose our manly virtue. So Orwell was a big believer in manliness, and a big opponent of homosexuality. Actually, opponent is the wrong word. He thought that homosexuality was a symptom of the disease of capitalism or industrialism in its dying, or capitalism in its dying stages. So he was very much against homosexuality. On an intellectual level, he had friends who were homosexuals. It didn't bother him at all. And that, by the way, that's one of the sort of things that you get with Hitchens. Orwell's anti-homosexual attitude is not fashionable now on the left. So Hitchens says that Orwell had an involuntary shudder against homosexuality, and he tried hard to fight against it. Well, this is completely wrong. Orwell was very blasé about homosexuality, and nothing gave him an involuntary shudder. He was quite he was physically sick and always in and out of sanatoriums for his health. But his attitude to life was that of a tough guy. He, for instance, he sneers at people who take aspirin. If you take aspirin, there's something morally bad about you, because you should just bear the pain because it's healthy, because you're a man, right? And probably you wouldn't mind women taking aspirin, but men shouldn't be like that. That would be Orwell. Hitchens likes Orwell so much that where there's any room to do so, he sort of wants to mold Orwell's views into compatibility with his own. And when he can't do that, like on the issue of homosexuality, then he attributes it to Orwell's feelings, you see, not to his reasoning. But Orwell was opposed to homosexuality, like many people were at the time, because they thought that it was a disease, a treatable medical condition caused by the conditions of life in an industrial society, and especially in big cities. So this was a very popular idea, and Orwell accepted it and preached it very vigorously.
Other elements, though, you described, this anti-progress idea seems to fit closer to the left today. I mean, almost nobody talks about socialism being this savior of industrialization or bringing more goods to people. I mean, we do it for environmental reasons, or we do it for social justice and equality. So, is Hitchens more on the track there, or no?
This is true. I mean, the 1930s left was very much in favor of technological progress and high economic growth. I mean, they didn't talk about high economic growth. They talk about developing the forces of production, the Marxist term. Whereas today's left is predominantly very much against economic growth and very much against developing the forces of production, and constantly complaining that the forces of production are developing far too rapidly. But it's not that they have come round to Orwell's earlier view, or at least it's not that simple. Orwell doesn't have much to say about the environment. He mentions it a couple of times very briefly. But basically, Orwell is against progress and machinery. Well, his views evolve. I've been talking about his views in 1936, when he'd just become a convert to socialism. After that, he gradually becomes more friendly to technology. And indeed, he sometimes flips back and forth. He'll say one thing at one point that's quite pro-technology. And then a year later, you'll find him saying something that reverses that and is quite anti-technology. In Orwell's early life, one of the books that became very famous was Erewhon by Samuel Butler. And that's a book that has all kinds of strange things in it, but in this strange world that is supposed to be beyond the mountains in New Zealand. And one of them is they have a law, the people in this society have a law against using any machine developed after a certain date. That you can be put to death for having a wristwatch because that would have been invented after that date. In other words, the people in the society have consciously made a decision to stop technological progress. And Orwell, actually quite late, I mean, he says, maybe we've got to have a law like that. Maybe we've got to put a stop to technological progress. But then, a month later, he'll be saying, we don't really have to worry about by the way, he doesn't use the term technological progress. He talks about the machine. But it means the same thing. But a bit later, he'll be saying, yeah, the machine isn't too much of a problem. And then there'll be little spots where he will say, we need the machine to liberate people so that they can live truly human lives, which, of course, was precisely the commonplace left view of his time. That was what the 1930s left held. That they didn't want the machinery for its own sake. They wanted machinery to raise people's living standards so the workers could have fuller lives. I mean, essentially, that's what they wanted. And Orwell resists this at first when he becomes a socialist, but gradually and sporadically and with some reversals, he comes to accept it. And that's why 1984 is not an anti-technology dystopia. There are dystopias which are anti-technology. Zamyatin's We, which in many ways is a kind of model for 1984, is an anti-technology dystopia. Brave New World is, this is the picture there you have is technology is very fully developed. Whereas in 1984 you have the impression as you read it, even though there are ICBMs and the surveillance equipment and all that kind of thing, you have the impression as you read it that life is terrible for people because technology has not been allowed to develop enough. These are some of the, it's a subtle, some of these shifts in Orwell's thinking after 1936 are quite subtle. But he's moving from a view that the machine is bad. Even in 1936, he says we can't do without it. So it's bad. But we can't do without it. But then, as time goes on after 1936, there's more emphasis put on we can't do without it. and less emphasis on it's bad. So, you know, that's how his view of technology evolves.
I wanted to sort of thread some of the chapters together. But before I do that, I just want to read a quote that will hopefully help us do that. It's from Susan Sontag. She says, "Imagine, if you will, someone who read only the Reader's Digest between 1950 and 1970, and someone in the same period who read only The Nation or The New Statesman. Which reader would have been better informed about the realities of communism? The answer, I think, should give us pause. Can it be that our enemies were right?" What I want to connect that Sontag passage to is the chapter or the part of Steele's book where he talks about the myth that communism was rampant among the intellectuals. But that Sontag passage, in a sense, seems to suggest that people had these serious illusions about the Soviet Union, yet at the same time, you argue in your book that there really wasn't much passion for the Communist Party among intellectuals. Is that a contradiction, or these things are just happening in a parallel universe, or what's going on?
Well, you know, I don't dispute that a lot of left-wing people in the 30s, 40s, and 50s had illusions about communism, but I think this is often greatly exaggerated. You know, in Britain, for example, there's a two-party system. One of the two parties is the Labour Party. It's an openly socialist party. It's a trade union party. It was founded, of course, before the Communist Party, so it was an established part of the political landscape. The Communist Party was founded in 1920 and came into a political landscape where there were other socialist parties. The Communist Party always tried to affiliate to the Labour Party, and I should perhaps say that the Labour Party was the kind of organization you affiliate to. You form an organization, whether it's a trade union or a socialist society, and you affiliate to it. They only introduced direct membership quite late. And even then, affiliation to the Labour Party was an important thing. So the Labour Party, right from the beginning, refused to allow the communists to affiliate. And where they found that branches of the Labour Party had communists in them who were active, they expelled those members. And if they still made trouble, they expelled those branches. And there was a continuous anti-communist policy by the Labour Party. This is one of the two major parties in the British political system. And this anti-communist policy of the Labour Party was very popular with the rank and file. It always won by huge majorities at the annual conferences of the Labour Party. It was very popular with the trade unions. So you're not getting a picture here of, you know, the Communist Party always wanted to get into the left and sort of infiltrate into the left, take over positions in the left. And they had some success here and there. But generally speaking, it was a failure. They remained sort of isolated. The time when they had the most influence in the left was the Popular Front period. So we're talking about 1934 to 1939. Prior to 1934, the Communist Party had a policy of attacking non-communist leftists, physically attacking them. Well, in many cases, this was the period of class against class, sometimes called third period, because of the theory that capitalism had entered a third period where it was ripe for revolution, and the people who were protecting it were the left. So they had to be destroyed so that the real representatives of the working class, the Communist Party, could move to the center of the stage. So up until 1934, there was the class against class. They were attacking the left. Then they started cozying up to the left. Basically because Stalin wanted an alliance with Britain and France against Germany. That was the thinking in Moscow. So that changed the Communist Party policy. So they started cozying up to the left in Britain and all over the world. It was the same thing because it was all coming from the same office in Moscow. You know, that was and they did have some success. They created the Left Book Club, which was very, very influential and which was totally controlled by communists and close fellow travelers of the communists. You know, so that was a period where their success was greatest. But of course, that was ended decisively by the Nazi-Soviet pact. But even before that, there's evidence that there was disillusionment among the left with the communists. So there are various ways of, and I have a whole sort of, I go into this in some detail. I give several pages to this. Martin Amis, the son of Kingsley Amis, he says that he talks about his parents being in the Communist Party, and he says that he actually makes the statement, which I quote. This is something I quote in the book, where he says that the Communist Party managed to convince everybody, all intellectuals, all around the world, that the purges and the Moscow trials were completely innocent. Something like that is what he says. That their version, Moscow's version of the purges and the trials, was accepted. Well, there are various ways you can disprove that. One of them is that the most central sort of intellectual voice of the left in Britain at the time was the New Statesman weekly paper. And the New Statesman constantly denounced the Moscow trials and the purges. And the New Statesman was quite sort of, it wasn't very anti-communist, and they took the view that, like many people on the left in Britain did, that what was going on in Russia was due to isolation and imperialist encirclement and all these excuses for why it was so terrible. And it wouldn't be like that if we had the same thing in Britain, because we had more democratic traditions and it would be different. But still, they didn't disguise the fact that these terrible atrocities were going on in Russia. And so, there are all sorts of facts like that you can bring out to show that a great deal of writing about this period casually and without thinking greatly exaggerates the extent to which the Communist Party line dominated the left. But the left weren't such suckers as that, actually. When Orwell became very anti-communist after his experiences in Spain, he got up, Orwell got up. This is what a lot of people don't understand about Orwell. When he went to Spain, he was a fellow traveler. He joined the militia of the POUM, which was a sort of ultra-leftist party that the communists would call Trotskyist, although it strictly wasn't Trotskyist. He joined that militia because the communist-controlled International Brigade wouldn't have him. So he was fighting in Aragon to the west of Catalonia, and all the time he was fighting there in the trenches, he wanted to get to Madrid where the real action was, so that he could be in the International Brigade. The Communist Party public line at that point was, we should subordinate everything to winning the war against the fascists, as they called the nationalists. We should subordinate everything to that, and that means cutting back on the revolutionary excesses and putting a democratic front on things. Now, of course, that wasn't the communists' real way of operating. They had something else up their sleeves, but that was the public line, and Orwell completely swallowed that. So all the time he was fighting in Aragon, he was thinking, I want to get out of here. I want to go to Madrid and fight for the communist-controlled International Brigade. So what happened was this. He took a brief leave in Barcelona. Barcelona was the nearest big city to the part of Spain where he was fighting. And when he got up on the morning of May 3rd, 1937, Orwell was a communist fellow traveler. And he was making plans to leave the POUM militia and go and fight for on the same side, ostensibly, the Republicans against the Nationalists, but to fight for the International Brigade. He got up but then, of course, something happened. What happened was street fighting broke out between the anarchists and the POUM, on the one hand, and the communist-controlled part of the Socialist Party and the civil guards, or assault guards, actually, the paramilitary police employed by the government in Valencia. This pitched battles broke out, and we're talking about street fighting with rifles and grenades here. And Orwell was caught up in this, and he naturally, and this is where he made the famous statement, that if ever you see a working man at odds with his natural enemy, the policeman, you know which side you're on. And of course, he meant he was on the side of the working man against the policeman. As a result of that experience, and then seeing how it was totally misrepresented by the communists, and the communists were successful in hoodwinking a lot of people into giving a totally false account of this civil war within the left. There was a civil war, but there was a civil war within the left as well. As a result of that, he became fiercely anti-communist. So that's something people don't understand, that from mid-1936 until mid-1937, Orwell was a fellow traveler. And part of the reason that they don't realize this is because he makes a few nasty remarks about the communists in The Road to Wigan Pier, but that was accepted, that you did that. But at the same time, in The Road to Wigan Pier, he made it clear he was in support of the Popular Front, and that was the touchstone. As far as the communists was concerned, as long as you weren't a Trotskyist, all that mattered was, did you accept the Popular Front? That was their touchstone. And also, of course, The Road to Wigan Pier has this famous, it's not famous, it should be famous, it's not famous, remark where Orwell says, there are people who pass resolutions against fascism and communism, i.e. against rats and rat poison. So, he's making clear in that cryptic remark that he knows there are people who say that both communism and fascism are equally bad. He's not one of them. On the contrary, he sees the Communist Party as a valuable agent against fascism. This is in mid-1936 when he's writing The Road to Wigan Pier. Now, after the experience of the May events in Barcelona in 1937, he completely changes his attitude to the Communist Party. And he's fiercely opposed to the Communist Party from then onwards. This is probably more than you want to hear, actually. But this is Orwell's trajectory as he becomes very anti-communist. Now, when he became an extreme anti-communist, as you might say, although that language wouldn't have been employed at the time, he was joining a lot of extreme anti-communists on the British left, people like Arthur Koestler, the ex-communist, people like most of the leaders of the ILP, the Independent Labour Party. That he was arriving at a position which was already held by quite a lot of people. Bertrand Russell was extremely anti-communist at this time. From 1920 until long after Orwell's death, Bertrand Russell was one of the most anti-communist people in Britain. And in fact, at the end of the Second World War, called for a preemptive nuclear strike against the Soviet Union. That's how anti-communist Bertrand Russell was at that time. So being a left-winger, and as we would say, looking back on it, an extreme left-winger, although it's a different context, and everybody accepted things that later would seem extreme. Everybody on the left accepted things that would later seem extreme. Being an extreme left-winger and being very anti-communist in the sense of against the Communist Party and against Stalinism, this was a very common view. It wasn't the majority view necessarily, but it was quite common and it was understood. And there is a tendency for people to say, "Oh, that's Trotskyism." There were. Orwell says in some place there are only 500 Trotskyists in Britain. I have no contact with them. Actually, 500 is probably a gross exaggeration. There were probably about 300 communists in Britain. None of them were capable people or people who wrote memorable stuff. The Trotskyism was largely a figment of the imagination of the communists. I mean, there were Trotskyists in the world, but they weren't committing vast acts of sabotage in the Soviet Union, not because they didn't want to. We don't know what they would have wanted to, but because there were so few of them and they were so puny. But they loomed large in the imagination of Joseph Stalin. He was paranoid, and therefore the entire communist movement became paranoid against Trotskyism. So, the actual picture of what was going on, I would accept that there's, that the left has many times been has a rosy view of communism. This happens a bit. I mean, there's a sense in which the left, as the dissenting party in politics, tends to have a rosy view of whoever the enemies of the country are. Like now they tend to have a rosy view of Venezuela or North Korea. Not because they're pro-communist particularly, but because they react against being patriotic. But if you look at the facts, look at some of the facts about the British left in the 1930s, 1940s. They were not hoodwinked. The majority of them were not hoodwinked by communism, and the rapidity with which they desert the people who had been fellow travelers ceased to be fellow travelers after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact shows you. Within a few weeks, most of them had come to their senses. I'm talking about the real fellow travelers, people like John Strachey. He took a few weeks to do it. The ones who were the most hard-bitten fellow travelers tended to leave after that pact.
We're so far away from it now. The young leftists that I see on television and talk to don't seem to know who Trotsky was. Is that? I mean, I'm not saying you. I'm saying the ones I talk to.
I'm a history teacher, so I feel like one should know who Lenin and Trotsky and Marx were. But when
I was young, in the 70s, when I was a kid, I mean, Trotsky was sort of a gray eminence in the background. I mean, just his death and his followers were there, but nowadays that seems to be old hat. Though Christopher Hitchens was a Trotskyite, right?
Yeah, I think he'd ceased to be a Trotskyist in any real sense by the time he wrote that the book on Orwell.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean, America's full of ex-Trotskyists. People. I mean, Burnham was a Trotskyist at one point. It's interesting, actually. It's a difference between the U.S. and the U.K. that in New York, where all these intellectuals hung out, they were in the Communist Party. They tended to become Trotskyists when they left the Communist Party, whereas in Britain that didn't happen at all. Of course, there weren't many who joined the Communist Party, but the ones that did, they mostly just became like Stephen Spender. They mostly they had nothing to do with Trotskyism, and I think the main reason for that is there was this huge Labour Party, which obviously represented the working class and called itself a socialist party, and was obviously likely to take power, within the next 10, 20 years. They didn't know how definitively it was going to take power in 1945, but still, that there was that kind of difference. So people in Britain were not tempted to become Trotskyists. There were little Trotskyist groups, and the present generation of Trotskyists in Britain will lovingly recount the doings of half a dozen people. In Balham was one place in South London. There was the Balham group. We need to itemize these things, just like we need to know about, millenarians expecting the end of the world and going onto a hilltop in the 19th century. But essentially, these people had no impact upon anything, really. Except to keep alive the idea there was such a thing as Trotskyism, and therefore the Communist Party would come after you if you were a Trotskyist. So the Communist Party branded Orwell a Trotskyist because this is one of the interesting things, is that when Orwell was in Spain, he was a fellow traveler, and he was not only saying, I'm going to go to Madrid and fight for the International Brigade, he was trying to convince members of the POUM militia to come with him, and that was the plan. That would have happened except for the street fighting. in May 1937 in Barcelona. It's a good thing that happened, because Orwell would certainly have been killed if he'd gone to Madrid. Certainly. The fighting was a lot more fierce, and if the nationalists didn't get him, the commissars would have got him. It was controlled by the NKVD. The thing was that it was tightly under the control of Soviet Russia. And then Orwell had a habit of talking back, and that the bullet in the back of the head. We would have remembered Orwell as this promising young man who never actually wrote anything significant, but died fighting for the left in Spain, like so many others. And the fact that he might have been bullet in the back of the head by the commissar wouldn't be mentioned or known about even. So there was a guy who wrote a book. I think his name was Paul Dean, Communism and British Intellectuals. And this was way back. This was like in the 50s or early 60s, something like that. I forget. It's in my bibliography in my book. And he got it right. He took the measure of this exaggeration of communist influence, and he pointed out that all the evidence from questionnaires that were done at the time and so on showed that most intellectuals had no love for communism. In fact, most intellectuals were not political. They weren't even, they didn't even have any political interests. But if they did, they weren't communists. They were probably left, in the sense they supported the left wing of the Labour Party. But they had no interest in, and that's also, there's a famous book on the phenomenon of fellow travelers by a man called David Court, Caute. It's called something like The Fellow Travelers, and some of the details in that book are controversial. But one point he makes and corroborates very well, and I don't think it's been seriously questioned, is that most fellow travelers didn't want communism to come into their own country. I mean, there are so many examples of this. The sort of founding figures of the British left, Beatrice and Mary Webb, would often have the Soviet ambassador to dinner, but they would never dream of having Harry Pollitt to dinner. The leader of the Communist Party. And they, generally speaking, all over the world, there were these fellow travelers who joined these front organizations, manipulated from behind the scenes by the communists. But these fellow travelers knew what was going on, and didn't want communism to be introduced into their own country, the great majority of them. They just thought that communism was a good thing for the Russians. It sounds cynical, but it's true.
Of course, we all know Orwell not for his political allegiances so much as for two books, right? Animal Farm and 1984, and that's the reason I guess we're all fighting over him, right? Is these two books?
Those two books win a lot of friends for Orwell, and then when you get into reading his essays or the collections of his essays and reviews, he's a very engaging writer. He convinces you that he's on your side. He's very good at that. One of the myths about Orwell is that he was unusually honest. Orwell was not unusually honest.
Well, is it a myth, or was everybody honest back then?
No. Orwell was very good at parading his own supposed honesty as a persuasive weapon. I'm being brutally honest here, and if you want to be brutally honest too, you will accept my opinions on this matter. That's Orwell. But Orwell wasn't particularly honest. He, as I point out in the book, he misrepresented things several times. But Orwell's he's very much an engaging writer. If you start to read his essays, you start to think, oh, he believes just what I believe. Lots of people do, and all political persuasions think, yeah, that's right. So he wins people over. And of course, Animal Farm wins people over very effectively, and 1984 wins people over. He's very persuasive, very good persuader. And so people become friends of Orwell in their minds. And the idea, oh, Orwell would never do anything as bad as that. Well, Orwell did some bad things.
Speaking of bad things, in terms of the debate surrounding Antifa, in particular, when Paul Joseph Watson, he's a YouTube sensation, I guess, among the perhaps alt-right. He works for InfoWars, but he said that Orwell would have hated Antifa. But in your book, you talk about the fact that, of course, Orwell was fighting fascists and killing them in Spain. I don't actually know if did he actually kill any fascists in Spain?
The thing is, most of the people he was fighting were not fascists either. I mean, the nationalist side in Spain was not really fascist. It was like the left. It was a coalition of different groups. One of which was this fascist organization, the Falange Española, Spanish Phalanx, and that was quite a small part of this sort of nationalist coalition against the left. As I point out in my book, the fascists, the phalangists, and the other groups on the nationalist side, they hated each other just as much as the communists and the anarchists did on the left. But
the point I wanted to make, though, and
you
can jump back in, is that Orwell actually defended or supported terrorizing certain members of the population, like priests and nuns and so forth. And I mean, if he's willing to do that, then it seems very likely that he wouldn't have any problem with Antifa clubbing a few Trumpistas to the ground.
Right. I mean, well, the question, on the question of whether Orwell would have hated Antifa, what I said was, I would not commit myself on what Orwell would have thought about that, but I did think that guy who attacked Paul Joseph Watson for saying he was completely ignorant for saying that was not right. In other words, if you're going to speculate about what Orwell would think today, there's so many hypotheticals. But if you then it doesn't show ignorance to say that Orwell would have hated Antifa. I mean, but the thing is, I mean, Orwell was not personally involved in these anti-Catholic atrocities where priests and nuns and monks were murdered and raped and so on, and churches were all desecrated. But he approved of them as part of the revolution, or he approved of them tacitly because they were part of a working class revolution as he saw it. And he saw the Spanish Catholic Church as being very corrupt and very much involved with the administration of capitalism in Spain. So that was his view. So he thought it was natural in a working class revolution that churches would be desecrated, priests, monks, and nuns would be killed and tortured and raped. So tacitly he approves of that. It's a bit different if Orwell was suddenly moved to 2017. Would Orwell think that Donald Trump was a fascist? I don't see much sign of Donald Trump trying to abolish democratic government or having bands of stormtroopers parading through the streets and all these sort of obvious signs of Italian fascism or Spanish nationalism or German National Socialism. Many of them seem to be missing. I suppose it does seem to me that there is a similarity, and that is economic nationalism, a belief that foreign countries are our enemies, and we can only do better if we outdo them, and we must also outdo their agents, domestic agents in our own country. So that's a sort of a theme that's a bit similar between Trumpism and fascism. But Trump so far has not shown any anti-democratic inclinations, and the Trump people have not engaged in violence. So I imagine if Orwell was brought, he'd see a big difference between fascism as he knew it Trumpism. The point is, Antifa don't just attack Trumpists; they attack anybody who isn't themselves. There are people who go to these demonstrations who are constitutionalists who believe in free speech, and they go to make the point that free speech should be tolerated. They get their heads bashed in by Antifa. Antifa doesn't hand out questionnaires. What is your ideological orientation? If you're not with Antifa, you get your head bashed in. They're just thugs. But by the way, I think they do have a sophisticated theory behind their thuggery. But maybe just thugs is wrong. They're thugs with an ideology. It's a different situation today. And fascism isn't a threat in the United States today. Nothing like fascism is a threat in the United States today.
I think Eric would like to push back against some of this. Go ahead, Eric.
Well, I actually can't. I need to leave in a little bit, but I'm
Okay.
interested in the question of what would you count as true fascism?
Well, what I meant there was simply that there was a fascist movement in Italy. It had a very precise ideology, which
A self-identified fascist movement. They
called itself fascism. And the National Socialists in Germany were very emphatic that they were not fascist. There were international gatherings of fascists, and the Nazis refused to attend because they said, we're not fascists. So that's what I meant, really. Now, there is also fascism as a theoretical category of the left. The left theory was that capitalism was in its last throes. And the capitalists were losing their grip because of the declining rate of profit, as predicted by Marx in Volume 3 of Capital. And in desperation, the capitalists had paid the fascists to reduce the living standards of the workers so as to prolong capitalism a bit longer. So the left view of fascism in the 1930s is very much bound up with the view that Orwell believed, actually, that capitalism is at the end of its rope, and that this is the last gasp. And in fact, the Communist Party sometimes said the coming to power of fascists is a welcome sign because it means that capitalism is in its final death agony. Nobody today thinks that capitalism's in its last throes, at least. I believe David Graeber does think that for environmental reasons, but generally speaking, the left doesn't think that. So the left's attitude to fascism in the 1930s was completely conditioned by this view. I mean, the reason so many people went to fight in Spain was because this was one of the hinges of history. What was the untold thousands of years hung upon the fate of the Spanish Revolution because it was fascism versus the working class. That's the way they saw it, and it was quite wrong, of course. As we now know, capitalism has a lot of life left in it, it wasn't at the end of its rope, and it isn't at the end of its rope now. So that's a big difference. It seems to me that Antifa and people like that, they hark back to these earlier epochs, but it's not really you can't really transpose these ideas because we're dealing with successful capitalism that is abolishing poverty throughout the world, capitalism that is lifting millions of people to untold heights of well-being. That's what's actually going on in the world today. In the 1930s, there was the Great Depression, and in Britain, Britain and Germany, it was particularly bad because Britain had a slump throughout the 20s. as well as getting worse in the 30s. In Germany, they'd had hyperinflation and recession in the 1920s. So there was a general gloom and doom about the future on all sides. Today, we're dealing with vibrant capitalism that is triumphing everywhere and that is improving the lot of everybody in the world at a fantastic rate. I mean, looking at the long view, what's going on in China and India, huge sections of the world's population are seeing palpable increases in their real income from year to year. This is the exact opposite of the way things were perceived in the 1930s, when it was perceived that everything was shrinking, everything was coming to an end. There was the old Marxist idea that no social order ever disappears until it's used up all its potential. You know, that idea that you're getting capital, and capitalism seemed to have used up all its potential, but nobody thinks that anymore.
We're worried about Orwell and who he belongs to, or who do we belong to him, as if he were in his own country. And there's a sort of a patriotism of literary figures. And yet the two books that I know of him, you know, I don't feel like I need to claim him so much as just like the books.
Right.
I mean, I read Shooting an Elephant as well. That's the only essay of his I think I've read, and I don't feel like I need to claim him in any sense.
Right.
But it's a very good essay.
Yes. It's a very good short story, I think. I mean, I think a lot of Orwell's nonfiction is really fiction, and that's one of them.
Okay.
Speaking of claiming, it seems like the left really wants to hang on to that word socialism, but as you point out in the book, they've essentially abandoned socialism because Orwell, as you pointed out earlier, was a hardcore socialist, as in nationalization of the means of production.
Right.
Now everyone is sort of some degree or other a neoliberal, although that's a choice epithet these days.
Mm-hmm.
But we're all capitalists now. It's just a matter of tinkering at the margins. How much of a national health system do we want to have?
Right.
How much market elements do we want to combine with it? Say Germany compared to Sweden, or Sweden compared to, UK.
Mm-hmm.
Can you comment on that? Why do they still want to claim that word? So why is that so important to them?
Well, it's a nice word, isn't it? I mean, it makes you feel sociable. But no, seriously. I mean, I think there are still a few genuine socialists left, and you see this in sympathy for Venezuela and Cuba, that kind of thing. There's still people who nourish the hope that it might work somehow. But I don't see it coming back, at least not in the next 100 years. I mean, it seems to me that what you've got now, you've got this, I don't know where it's going. You've got this mixture of, anti-sexism, anti-racism, and anti-Islamophobia, and all the other deplorable things that we have to be opposed to. But most people who put that forward don't seem to want to abolish capitalism. They don't have. If they do, they don't have a plan to do it. People in the 30s had a plan to do it.
Right. Well, David Horowitz insists that Barack Obama was a communist, and just wouldn't fess up to it. And I know a lot of people who think that Bernie Sanders is a full socialist, but he just won't say it.
Right. Well, Bernie Sanders in 2016 said that an example of socialism that he would like to see was Denmark. Yeah. It just so happens that in 2016, if the Heritage Foundation releases this thing every year of comparing all the countries in the world for economic freedom. And it means essentially business freedom. I don't think they include things like immigration as one of the freedoms, but it's essentially freedom to invest and that kind of thing. And 2016, when Bernie Sanders made that statement, was the 1 year where Denmark became a little bit closer to laissez-faire capitalism than the United States, according to that Heritage Foundation report. I mean, they're neck and neck. I think they're 17th, equal 17th. You can look it up, online. It's an easy thing to look up. But I think they're equal 17th on the for economic freedom. In other words, the 15 countries that are more economically free than the United States and Denmark. But it looked in the Obama years as though that Denmark was going to pull ahead and be much more economically free than the United States. Maybe, hopefully, that's not going to happen now. I don't know. Trump is a many-faceted jewel.
That might be one way of describing a coprolite, but
to be appropriately vague. Yes. But at least he has deregulated some stuff, although I see he's going back on this Paris thing. But anyway, so Bernie Sanders I think thinks if you've got a generous welfare state and a single payer health service, and a few other things, minimum wage and all that sort of thing. Then you've got socialism. I don't think he thinks in terms of having the government own everything.
Oh, right. So even Corbyn perhaps is not really a socialist, because given the opportunity, he probably would stare into the abyss and then pull back, right?
Right. Yeah.
Though his colleague said just the other day that the insurrection, he wants an insurrection on the streets of Great Britain.
Well, he's going to get it. But he's not going to like it.
He's not going to like it. Well, we often don't like what we get when it comes to politics. Here we are. I really appreciate you're taking time with us.
Well, don't mention it. I'm glad to be here, and thanks very much.
And we'll
you,
talk
David.
again.